Welcome to the City Club of Portland, Oregon's premier citizens forum. We're delighted you're with us today. I'm Don Williams, president of City Club. Our speaker today is Dr. Gerald Sheble, professor of electrical and computer engineering at Portland State University. His topic, today's energy decisions, tomorrow's reality, examining current energy alternatives. For the benefit of our radio and television audiences, please turn off your cell phones and other electronic devices. First, a few announcements. There will not be a Friday forum next week, November 23rd, the day after Thanksgiving. But join us in 2 weeks for a presentation by Carlos Kalmar, musical director of the Oregon Symphony, and his topics will be how the symphony compares to other orchestras across the nation, the changes made under his direction, and the challenges the symphony faces as it moves forward. Those of you who are history buffs are going to love the November selection for the Citizens Read book group. We will be reading Michael Monk's book, The Portland Red Guy, Sights and Stories from Our Radical Past. Learn about the Portland Police Bureau's Red Squad, disruption on the campus of Portland State University in the 60s, and finally, a cast of forgotten radicals, revolutionaries, and just plain oddballs who fought for the freedoms many of us now take for granted. Monk will lead a discussion at 7 p.m. on Monday, November 26th at City Club Commons, and you can purchase a book at the back of the room or at the City Club Commons. Space is limited, so please RSVP with Kim at the City Club office. And on Friday, November 30th, that's 2 weeks from today, drop by the City Club Commons for a holiday-themed open house. And this final Friday is open to club members and their guests. It's from 4:30 to 6 p.m. The event is free, open to the public, and no reservation is required. The City Club's annual fund is absolutely critical for us to continue bringing you great programs and our excellent research. You've either received or will be receiving an envelope and a letter, and there's envelopes in the bulletins like this. Please take the time to read the letter, and it explains why we need your help in this fund drive. To this point, we've received 40 gifts. Let's try to make that 200 by the next Friday forum. We're fortunate to have terrific corporate sponsors for this program, and this quarter's sponsors are the law firm of Barron Liebman, LLP, and Girding Edlin Development. Thank you for your support. Our energy choices have become increasingly complex. Each day we read about gasoline prices reaching new highs, and we hear terms such as peak oil and renewable energy ranging from hydro and wind to solar, wave, and geothermal. We hear about green buildings, green roofs, and green power. College co-eds now even want their dates to have a low carbon footprint. How do you get educated and stay informed given the expanded scope of this topic? Well, one solution is to either listen to or attend City Club Friday forums. And today's forum is the first in a series over the coming year that will address our current energy challenges. For example, last week we listened to author Michael Schellenberger. He told us that society has changed, but the politics have not kept up. Environmentalism must die so something new can take its place. And last summer, we heard Shell Oil President John Hoffmeyer state, "My primary message is that we face fundamental and pressing energy challenges. There's no soft solution and no soft landing. Every route forward has significant economic, environmental, and technological challenges. For example, the demand for ethanol has increased the price of corn and soybeans by 40%. In our Columbia River Gorge, massive wind turbines are killing raptors, wild eagles, and hawks." Today, we're fortunate to have Dr. Gerald Sheble discuss energy choices. He will address the ripple effects of energy decisions throughout our economy and the environment. He will give us suggestions on how ordinary citizens, elected officials, and policymakers can make and promote sound energy choices. Dr. Sheble came to Portland in 2006 from Iowa State University. And at Iowa State, he chaired the Electric and Power Energy System program. He now teaches in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Portland State University. He served as an energy consultant to energy companies around the world, and he advises companies on the feasibility and the implementation of wind, solar cells, and microturbines, and even assisted with the evaluation of wind generation in China and Europe. Our speaker received both his bachelor's and his master's degree in electrical engineering from Purdue University and his PhD from Virginia Tech. He then went on and got an MBA at the University of Iowa with a minor in finance and economics. Now, Dr. Sheble's technical expertise and intellectualism can be demonstrated by reading his research, but I want to warn you, this is not casual reading. His topics have included computational intelligence techniques for optimization, and one that's less technical, market plane algorithms. But wait, he's not just good at math and science. He's also an avid sailor. He sailed over a dozen of America's largest lakes, the Gulf of Mexico, and in the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. And in addition, he does videography of modern dance and is an expert still photographer. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gerald Sheble.
Well, good afternoon. It's been a rather interesting time. Since I was asked to give this talk, I've been trying to figure out what should be the proper title, and we went through about 6 of them, primarily because we get to where we are because of history. The U.S. has been fortunate. Unlike Europe, World War II demolished most of their infrastructure, and they got to build fresh. That's nice. We have equipment in the U.S. in the Northwest here in the electric system that was installed in 1916 and is still in service. Now, that's good and that's bad. It was only meant to last 50 years, but it's approaching 100. So how do we make massive changes? The easy way is to say it's required by law. So right now, Congress has a lot of initiatives, and I wish I knew in the last minute if the renewables are in or out of the Energy Act that is before Congress. If you've ever watched this political action in terms of what is in and out, it's rather interesting. It's also interesting that the Republicans came forward with the idea of a carbon market or a pollution market, emission market, primarily for raising taxes, in all honesty, in terms of if you look at the bill that they proposed. They're now considering plug-in electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland is going to demonstrate how an automobile can be controlled by a computer in an independent system operator's facility to either charge or discharge over an hour. So they can turn it back on and off, so they can store energy or draw energy from it. Their hope is that you will buy a car and use electricity for the fuel, or maybe a biodiesel type car, and they can use the battery when you're not driving, so they can store energy and take care of the problem of renewables in terms of scheduling energy when we wish to use it. They're also considering a proposal called the smart grid. This implies the old grid was dumb, and that's a little facetious, but it's really quite true. Most of the protection equipment on our power systems were designed 50 and 60 years ago. That technology has not changed. The computers we now put in place are doing the same thing that equipment did 50 years ago. The grid does not allow you to connect and disconnect everything at will, such as a plug-in electric vehicle. There will have to be some major infrastructure changes. Wind and solar cells are, of course, receiving quite a bit of tax credits, not only from the federal but from states. Biofuels are, of course, of high interest to remove the use of oil. and nuclear is coming back to the forefront as an alternative. Each has its own problems, and they're not decoupled from each other. The major impact today is distributed generation. It's amazing how many companies have found that owning their own power plant was cost-effective. One of the executives at ACOA was quite proud that they can decide 5 minutes before the hour what they will do the next hour. Will they make electricity as their major product or aluminum? It depends which makes more profit, because they have active trading floors in terms of trading electricity. Now, most of these companies are also going to what's called the gas turbine or microturbine. Most of the high schools in the city of Chicago have their own generator, and they can supply the grid with electricity. Now, why did they all go out and get their own microturbine? Well, why did they have gas in the first place? They needed heat in the winter. If you have a microturbine, you get heat plus electricity, which you also need for your school, for all of your activities. Also, what about backup generation, reliability? What is your reliability in the electric grid as of today? Anyone know? A zero? Hopefully it's above zero. But the way the industry has always measured reliability is their design goal was that there'd be one day in 10 years that you would be out of service. Now, that's really hard after the blackout of '65 to go 10 years without another outage. It's also hard when you're in the act of deregulating to not have a blackout, because we don't know who's on first base, what is on second, et cetera, in terms of how the business should function when you try to tear it apart. One of the ways to have better reliability, as many people have done in the Midwest, is to buy a little Honda generator in the backyard, because when it gets cold, you need electricity for that gas furnace to work, and you can start it up. Many farmers have been able to hook their tractors up to generators for emergency use as a viable alternative. The plug-in hybrid electric vehicle is one of the most unusual distributed generators, because we're not hoping for a few of them, but one at every house. That is extremely distributed generation and will require a totally different change in the infrastructure of the distribution network that we use for electricity today. It's kind of interesting, I think, that Congress is trying to get us to use electric cars. How do all of you feel if all of a sudden a company turns your car on and off? I had a hard enough time with my son asking for the keys, but to hook it up and allow some other company to all of a sudden start the car up and use it is, to me, a little strange. How many of you have your appliances under control by the utility? In this part of the U.S., most of you do not. In Florida, almost all of the air conditioners are under control of the central computer. They can be turned off for 5 minutes every 15 minutes if there is a problem in the electric grid. They can also be turned off just if the frequency starts to decrease a little bit. Of course, if it increases, they try to get them to do the opposite action, to balance. The interesting thing about solar cells is that Portland is not supposed to be a good place for solar cells, correct? Like today, you're not going to see a lot of sun. Then why are people installing solar cells here? It's because they don't have to work all of the time to provide a benefit. They just have to work enough to take care of their cost of operation. If you watched a public television show about a year ago, it was showing how solar cells in New Mexico, Arizona, are extremely cost-effective. One of the people they interviewed said, "Why did you install $15,000 of solar cells?" He says, "It was an easy choice. I could put $15,000 in a bank and get 1% return on investment, or I could buy solar cells, install them, and get 18% return on investment. This is an IQ test. You fail if you go to the bank. Not only do I get a better return on investment, but I also know that I have electricity, even if no one else does." And with the cost of solar cells coming down, it'll be quite interesting to see where they are really installed in the near future. Wind generation is quite interesting. When do we have wind during the day? Morning and evening. When do we have peak electricity use? Noon. How do we take care of this small difference? One of the interesting projects I worked on 2 years ago in the state of California was to try and decide how to take care of all the wind generation they intend to install. And they intend to install enough that they're going to reach about 15% to 20% of their energy needs by wind. That's huge. How do you take care of this difference in time? Well, what they've just approved 2 years ago is to go to Tehachapi Mountain, take a big part of it off, and make a rather large water reservoir at the top. They will pump water up to the top when energy is cheap, let it flow back down when energy is expensive, and therefore they can store the wind energy as water in this mountain reservoir. This is not a new idea. There's also one in Ludington, Michigan. There's Tom Thumb in Missouri. Unfortunately, the one in Missouri, one of the dams gave way and it washed out everything below it. But there are quite a few of these around the world. And one of the things we did in Portugal to take care of the wind generation is we justified the installation of a pump storage unit that will flood not only Portuguese land, but also Spanish land, because it's at the top of the river. And that river can now be pumped backwards to store energy and then allowed to run free again to generate energy once again. The amount of land being consumed there is extremely large. So wind generation has its own problem. One of the interesting things about the fuels today is, what's the price of oil today? Didn't somebody say a little while ago it would never get to $100 a barrel? Right now, the last predictions I have, it'll be 120 by the end of the year. How do we adjust for such large changes? When the state of California had their energy crisis and their prices increased dramatically, many companies had to leave the state. If the electric energy cost is 20% of your cost of production, if it increases by a factor of 3, how do you stay competitive? Working just midnight to 7 a.m. does not help. Many did that, but it just doesn't help. So they move out of the state or they move out of the country, one of the two. And these are some of the things we have to think about as far as when we start thinking about using renewables and going to markets and what is the proper mix of generation to do. The fuel cell, if you listen to many, will save us. We'll have one in every car, and it will allow us to use energy when we need it in a place we need. Fuel cells are really quite simple. The basic fuel cell separates H2O into hydrogen and oxygen. Getting oxygen out of a machine is kind of nice next to everything else that machines produce. But one of the interesting things about fuel cells is they don't need hydrogen to work. Many fuel cells can work just as well off natural gas or some kind of methane. It's quite interesting to me that the City of Los Angeles has decided to install a fuel cell at their sewage plant. Okay, most of you do realize that a lot of dairy farms have installed gas turbines so they can convert the other product cows make to make methane to produce electricity. Well, the City of Los Angeles is going to use the other product humans make to generate electricity by fermenting the sewage and come up with a positive result in terms of electricity and fertilizer that can be redistributed. So the intent there is the amount of things thrown into the Pacific is going to be just water, hopefully in the very end. That's quite a good win-win. How many of you have heard about the new heat pumps? There's quite a few programs. There's even one here in Portland for everyone to install their own heat pump. What's really interesting to me as far as heat pumps are concerned is that we don't need air for them anymore. The old heat pumps would always take the heat or coolness out of the air and put it into the home. The new heat pumps use groundwater. You can do this in a couple of ways. You can run several hundred feet of pipeline through your backyard, about 6-7 feet down, and therefore, because the ground is more of a constant temperature down there, you get a more efficient heat cell performance for cooling or for heating. Alabama Power in 1979 decided this was a pretty good idea, but instead of just using the ground, why don't we put 20,000 gallons of salt water aside? So what they did for their corporate headquarters is built a rather large swimming pool of salt water. They freeze it at night when electricity is inexpensive, so that during the day the compressors do not have to function when electricity is expensive. It paid for itself in 2 years. Most of the shopping malls in the Southeast have done this now. It is just extremely cost-effective for large loads. It is just now being introduced for residential use. Fortunately, it's the small businesses in the middle that don't have quite a nice solution coming forward at this time. But these are some of the new appliances that are coming up. Does it ever seem silly to you that you have this refrigerator that takes the heat out of the inside and throws it into your kitchen, and then you buy an air conditioner to throw the heat back through one more wall? Why doesn't the refrigerator throw it outside immediately? Well, that's a combined system. That's more complex. And by the way, we can't install that ourselves typically. But how do we get to that kind of efficiency given the number of refrigerators we have? How many refrigerators do you think are in the U.S.? It's the population plus about 2 or 3 times. It's around 2.4 is what I was told. The electric demand in the city of Chicago, I used to work for Commonwealth Edison, the electric utility there, 15% of their electric demand was used for refrigeration of food at the distribution warehouses and the grocery stores alone, not including homes. That's the way our food industry is structured. We use a tremendous amount of cooling. One of the more interesting cooling places is, do you know where most of our food is stored in Missouri? This is supposed to be a secret, sort of. It's stored in an old mine, about 200 feet underground. And it's kept at a constant almost 10 degrees. My nephew has the job of inventory of food there. He's an industrial engineer. He's one of the few people I know who goes to work in a parka and boots 365 days a year, because it is cold down there. So air conditioning and refrigeration is becoming a significant portion of our demand. Professor Sheble at MIT in 1980 suggested that all of these appliances should have a device on it, which he called vapor. Kind of sounds like vapor, but it's not. He wanted to put a device on every appliance that when the frequency is outside an acceptable range, the appliance would turn off, and therefore the system would stay on and not have a blackout. How many of our appliances have that today? None. How many of you would know to buy an appliance with that, or would you want to buy an appliance that way? How many of you would like to have your refrigerator go off just because the frequency is down? How much food do you want to replace? It depends how long you want to allow that to be off. One of the interesting things with the carbon footprint that's coming about is buying trees. Who is planting the most trees in the world right now? Gazprom, Russia. They're arguing in the European Union that by planting thousands, tens of thousands of trees in Brazil, they should get offsetting carbon credits. So just as somebody's tearing down the trees in the Amazon, somebody else is planting them again, which is an interesting paradigm. But this is one of the things that I think we're going to see as we realize that we're a global economy in energy. One of the things that convinced me that this is a global issue is I did some work for Mid-American Energy, one of Buffett's companies. And we did a lot of market analysis in terms of the electric and gas grid and competition, who is cornering the market, et cetera. And what amazed me is for the price of natural gas to be calculated in Ames or Des Moines, Iowa, you start in Dubai and work your way around the world. When Russia started to turn off the valve of gas to Europe, and by the way, Northern Europe gets most of its gas from Russia. The Spanish and Portuguese countries get all of their gas from Africa. There's only about 4 pipelines in all of those connections. When Russia started to close their valves in the pipeline as they were negotiating with Europe on the price of gas, guess what happened to all those LNG freighters that people don't want here? They changed course in the middle of the Atlantic and Pacific and started heading towards Europe. Many companies figured, I'd rather go to court and pay the fee of not delivering and make more money in Europe with my gas, if that's what it comes to. It is indeed a global economy and a global change. I assume everybody got the yellow sheet from downstairs? Did anybody not get one? I can give you another one. Because I think it's part of the problem in that if you read the sheet, it says LNG is needed for California. It's needed for all of the U.S. Yes, California did decide by popular vote to not allow LNG. So instead, Mexico is building 2 LNG terminals. They're going to put a hefty tax on it and sell it to California. They have no problem with that extra tax. They love that extra income. Canada is doing the same. There are 7 LNG terminals going into Canada because the United States does not want the LNG terminal. We just want the gas. And there's a lot of myth going on in terms of LNG, and this is what I think is the problem. Too many people do not understand the technology, and we don't have the proper information presented to us in a non-biased form. And I think that's where the newspapers are not helping us out. Should re-regulation stay here? Do you know what I mean by re-regulation? In 1992, the Energy Act was passed that required companies to deregulate. That's a bad word because the laws were not going away, they're just being replaced with different laws. The idea of deregulation was to allow us as people to buy electricity from whoever we wanted, provide open competition. It was a rejection of the regulatory environment where electricity was rather inexpensive for us, to be honest, but it was not the same in every state. If you compared the price of electricity at that time to the price of electricity in Maine, it was a 3-to-1 ratio. Why is electricity in Maine more expensive than electricity in Iowa? Companies like GM and others who wish to build factories do not understand this. I understand it because I know Maine is very much against building new transmission lines or new power plants. They would rather force people to do without. Iowa, on the other hand, has no problem building power plants. As a matter of fact, the state government has basically authorized Mid-American to build 2 new plants, put them into the rate base, and guaranteed that those costs would be recovered. It's rather interesting in the deregulation that, of course, the gas markets were deregulated, airlines were deregulated, telephone was deregulated, but the electric grid is still not deregulated. And many would argue that the present electric markets are not functioning properly. I am one of those who would say they're not functioning properly because there's not true competition. A market is intended to get buyers and sellers together so that you come to an agreeable price. How many of you have bought or sold electricity lately? Unless you're in the business to do so, you have not done so. There are many opportunities for new jobs in these markets, I'll guarantee that. Most of my graduate students go off to work for them, Constellation, Dinergy, whatever. The money is excellent. It makes a professor's salary look kind of pathetic at times. One of my last PhD got a signing bonus. Just because he agreed to go to work, they gave him a check for $10,000. That's kind of sweet, I think. Starting to look like a basketball player. Get the salary a little bit up, that'd be fine. But the idea of these markets is good, but if there's no competition, they're not really markets. If we add these markets to the emission markets that are planned, this is a complex set of portfolio contracts to evaluate. Are we willing to pay for the infrastructure to evaluate them? First of all, we need the information to value anything. Second, we need the communications computers to do so. And third, and most importantly, we need the engineers and economists to do so. It's interesting to me that in these interconnected markets, the green buildings are gaining some traction, the LEEDs type concept. There's quite a few LEEDs buildings at Portland State. There are many earth-bermed homes or underground homes in Minnesota where it gets rather cold in the winter for energy efficiency. But the real thing is that we have lost several resources. We've lost the use of CNG. Does anybody remember what CNG was? Compressed natural gas? When the gas pipelines were deregulated, they disappeared. They did not have enough market infrastructure to stay in place. Is that really such a bad outcome? I think it is, because it went so quickly we had no time to value that industry per itself and make a good decision. We need history and time to evaluate what we should do. In terms of the networks that we have available, how hard is it to get a train delivery of coal to a power plant in the U.S. today? If you wanted to build a new coal-fired facility in Texas, you have zero probability of getting any coal. It's not because there's not enough mines, there's just not enough train track from Montana to you. So what do? Instead? You apply for 2 nuclear power plants. What's happened to our train infrastructure that was so good many years ago? It is gone. It is totally congested. A few years ago, San Diego had a backup of shipping of new products arriving in the U.S. because the trains could not remove the new products from the harbor. So instead, they started shipping to San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, whatever, which is probably a good outcome to some extent to spread things out. But it was done because of something that was overlooked. We don't have enough train infrastructure to move the industry products we have. All of these markets are coupled. One of the major outcomes of the pipeline deregulation is that before the gas pipelines were deregulated, they were all radial, and there wasn't a whole lot of them. If you look at a gas pipeline network today, it looks as dense and complex as the electric power grid. It's amazing how quickly people will build gas pipelines if they can make the money, and especially if they can borrow it. In the Midwest, what is the major way to move coal? It's our river system. Is the Mississippi still a river? Between St. Louis and Minneapolis-St. Paul, I believe right now there are 38 dams with large reservoirs. It's almost to the point of one spills into another. And they're going to build 3 more, they think. I don't know that the river is really there anymore. It's really just a sequence of holding ponds from one facility to the next. The major reason for this is 2, flood control and moving coal and corn and all the other agricultural products on barges. Very efficient way of transportation when you're going downriver from the source to where it's going to be shipped from in New Orleans. In terms of the other devices that people are thinking about for the smart grid, they want the ability for any appliance you connect to talk to the grid, and if the price is right, it will start up. I was living in Paris for a summer 2 years ago, and I had a washer-dryer, the same device, and it gave me a bunch of options as to how I could wash my clothes. I could either do it immediately, or I could wait until an hour before I got from home, so then when I got home, the dryer would just be done and I could pick them out right away. Or I could do it when the price is below a certain level. Doesn't mean it'll be done when you get home. Okay? And I think it'd also be rather strange in the middle of the night when the price of electricity finally drops low enough that your washer and dryer go out just as you're getting to sleep. That's another outcome I think we have to think about. One of the interesting things to me is we're tearing down many hydro dams. I'm not going to say this is good or bad. I'm just saying we may not have thought this through. I agree that it's nice to have a river running as it was. But instead of hydro dams, are you willing to put up nuclear power plants? This is sort of the choice you're making. If you don't want the hydro dams, do you mind the LNG facility for the gas turbines instead? Or do we start denying electricity? One of the most recent acts in Congress is to allow for electric utilities to allocate electricity. What does this mean to you? You may not get it. You may not be deemed necessary or sufficient cause to deserve electricity today. That's quite dramatic for a country that has had the premier electric system in the world. I don't know if you've traveled to other countries. I was once in the Middle East, and one of the things they told me is that you don't take the elevators. And I said, why not? And they said, well, you never know when the electricity is going to go off. So a lot of times the elevator would read in Portuguese be a pé, which means by foot. Don't take the elevator, it's about to shut down. So you get off at whatever floor you're closest to and you go to the stairway. Is that the kind of lifestyle we wish? That's part of the consequences of the decisions that we make. In terms of the future, to a large part of it is already here. Tehachapi is going to be built at about a $12 billion price tag for a pumped hydro storage unit. Not cheap, not really expensive. Nuclear power plants, the companies are now asking for federal funds to back up their construction. One of the interesting things I think about nuclear power plants is 20 years ago, that was a dead issue, correct? We'd never do those things again. How many universities have a nuclear engineering program today? I was at Iowa State. We closed ours. We closed ours 20 years ago at Iowa State. Portland State does not have one. What does it take to have a nuclear power plant built? You need some nuclear engineers, by the way. Right now, if we wanted to build in the U.S., we'd have to probably go to a French company, Areva. It's fully owned by the French government because they can build power plants. They've done it quite well in France and have been able to refuel the plants quite cost effectively. The idea I want to get to you is that reality is not pleasant in all aspects, and that when we make one decision, something pops up somewhere else. Have you ever played the game where that gopher comes out of the hole and you have to hit it on the head and it comes up somewhere else? That's exactly what energy is all about. If we cut off something somewhere, it's going to pop up somewhere else, and it may be in a less favorable place than we intended. And what we need to do is demand that we get more information, better information, so we can accept what is being done. We can understand what is being done. We can understand the choices and the alternatives that we are being given. I think it's rather interesting that we're converting most of the things we used to throw away into energy. Iowa State won an award because it converted its power plant to burn tires instead of allowing them to just clog up the rivers and the creeks in the Midwest. It's amazing to me that we have buildings today that, like the Sears Tower in Chicago, that the transformers provide most of the heating. The transformers generate enough heat that they can provide most of the building's heat. There are 3 substations in the Sears Tower, one at the basement, one about a third of the way up, and the other one 2/3 of the way up, being that large of an electric load. The main thing I wish you would start thinking about is that energy is a portfolio. There's no one simple choice. We have to use a bunch of things. I think the major problem in Congress is they're hoping and wishing for a silver bullet, one thing that fixes everything. That has never been true in the world, and I'm sure it will not be true in the future. Instead, I think what we should do is we should use renewables as much as we can. We probably will have to go to nuclear for some short period of time because it's not only the nuclear fuel that has to be stored, it's the plants after they're decommissioned and all the other gear that comes in contact with the radiation. And I think we also have to start thinking about farmland. If we're really going to use ethanol, do we really wish to convert farms to homes? How much corn would it take to replace oil today? One of the estimates I had is we'd have to tear down everything and plant corn everywhere. That doesn't seem rational. So I think we have to start looking at how we're using all of our resources, our rivers, our wind, our solar. And another thing we have to do is start agreeing whether we agree with each other or not. One of the major energy issues in the U.S. is the states do not agree with each other, nor with the federal government. Many in this last deregulation act, the states have said, you're violating state rights, we're going to take you to court. We don't have to follow federal law. Our energy is inexpensive. Iowa has not deregulated, and it will not because its electricity is less than any other state nearby. If they deregulated, it would go to an average. Are you willing to see Congress pass a bill that would require the construction of high-voltage DC to the northwest so the city of Chicago can tap into Bonneville Power? Guess what would happen to your electric prices if they were allowed to do so, or if they were forced to do so by law? We'd have the same price as Chicago or Iowa. My electric bill in Iowa during the summer was $495 per month. That was high. It would go down to about $250 a month in January. The electric bill I'm seeing here right now looks very advantageous next to that. But deregulation intends to average out the bill for all of us, all across the 50 states. So I think we have to think about what we want to do. How do we wish to live? What is our lifestyle we want? How do we get from one point to another, either through private or mass transportation? And I think we should look to other countries, especially Europe, who I think have invested a tremendous amount of money in infrastructure for energy and for transportation. I don't have any answers. I wish I did. If so, I'd probably go off and form a company, and I'm sure I'd have plenty of investors, because it's amazing at how many people realize that this is the key issue today. But what we really need is good information and not everybody's bias. And one thing we need to do is start demanding that we get the full information and all the consequences when we make a decision in one place, because we don't need it to pop up some other place in our backyard. Time for questions?
Asking questions is a privilege of City Club members. Please limit your questions to 30 seconds or less and end them with a question mark instead of an exclamation point. Today's first question will be asked by our board host, who's Ted Kay. Ted is the treasurer of the club and the vice president of finance at Teledirect International, which is a technology committee. He got his MBA at Stanford and has been a member of the City Club since 1990. Interestingly, he edits the scholarly Journal of Flag Studies and publishes and consults in the field of flag design. Ted?
Thank you, Don. Professor Sheble, you're in the education business also, as well as the energy business. You've described all of the things we might be considering, both with new technologies and old technologies. How are we doing in the education sector to bring people along and educate them to be ready for these technologies?
Well, as I mentioned, most nuclear engineering departments were closed 15 to 20 years ago, so I would say we're probably batting zero there. But in general, I think our education system is in trouble. I know you're going to say, okay, you're an educator, you're biased. But I'll be honest with you, when I started as a professor after working in industry for 15 years, the enrollments were far higher than they are today. At Iowa State this year, in electrical engineering, it was very typical 10 years ago to have 300 to 500 applicants. Today, they had 30. Most of our young people do not wish to be engineers. It's too hard. It takes too much time, too much effort. And after all, most engineers have been outsourced, have they not? Yes, we've had ups and downs, but I think most engineers who are good have stayed employed. It has not been a good road, and engineers have not done well. I think education is in a crisis because nobody wants to pay for this degree. Most states have cut their state funding. Portland State and Oregon is quite fortunate. Purdue University gets 5% of their cost through state funding, 5%. They're virtually a private school. If you go to Iowa State, they're down to 11% now. We'll probably go below 10 next year. We have a bunch of universities that are supposedly public, but they look private in the way they're funded today. And it's very hard, and it's going to get more expensive as the engineering shortage increases. There was testimony given last week in Congress that in 5 years, 40% of the engineering jobs, 44% to be more exact, will not be filled because there's nobody to fill it as the baby boomers retire. So those jobs will have to go overseas.
Professor Steve Shell, member. Energy and climate change are linked together inextricably. PGE and Pacific Core get huge amounts of the power we use from coal-fired or gas-fired resources. We decided, United States decided not to participate in Kyoto. That may or may not have been a mistake, but next month in Bali, they're going to take a look at the next step beyond Kyoto. What would you recommend for policies the United States should consider in dealing in Bali next month?
Anytime you disturb a market, especially with a new market, with another byproduct that has to be watched or allocated, and that's the idea of the market, is to allocate and therefore make something more supportive or reduce it, you have to do it very carefully. I know the Kyoto Agreement was not passed because it was going to be too expensive. The estimates on what it was going to cost were all over the place. It was very hard for anybody to come up with a good, solid number. I think one of the things the U.S. has to do, which it has not done, is start to monitor enough to know the impact of these new markets, to accurately know them. It's going to be a problem because other countries want our lifestyle. If you go to another country like China, Portugal, they assume we live like they do in the movies, right? We all have a 5,000, 6,000 square foot home, 3 or 4 Hummers, whatever, and they want the same thing. China was selling about 1,200 SUVs per day last year. Can you imagine that number of cars being added and the gasoline to run them? I think what we need to do is we need to get the accurate information and realize that we're going to have to share our energy with others.
Jim Zarin, City Club member. During your talk, you made frequent use of the word "we" to refer to the society, I think. We need to get better information. We need to figure out these things. We need to allocate choices, resources, et cetera. I'd be interested if you could just talk about, is that we the market? Is that we government through regulatory apparatus? How well are we set up as a society to do these things that you refer to we needing to do?
The we I'm referring to is me and my fellow citizens. We elect people to represent us, and we need to know what they really stand for, where their agenda really is, and what are the issues we need to contact them on. Are the executive branch, or the administrative branch, and the congressional branch ready for this new problems in our exponential world? I don't think so. I don't know that anybody is, to be honest. But the we I was referring to is everyone in this room. We have to be better educated. We have to understand. As we're talking at the table earlier, it's amazing that our Constitution was written by people who had really very little chance to education as we do today. And yet they made a document that is revered around the world and has stood us well for over 2 centuries. So the we I refer to is everyone here. We make the decisions. I assume we're going to stay a democracy. And we need the information so we can vote intelligently.
Merritt Lynn, member. You mentioned the global nature of this problem and the steps that are being taken in this country and Europe. You just mentioned China. Do you see any interest in China and India, 2 huge economies, toward dealing with this as we are here?
I had the chance to visit China 5 years ago. I was invited by a venture capitalist to go and talk to the Chinese government about installing wind generation in the province just north of North Korea. When I went there, this venture capitalist was fortunate enough not to tell me ahead of time that during my trip I'd be accompanied by 2 soldiers and a general. Because in that province, poverty still reigns. The poverty in that area is unbelievable. There are people living on top of their rice paddies. A family of 4 will have a hut roughly 4 feet by 5 feet. That's it. That's their home. The bathroom is the rice paddy. They're in terms of whatever you want to do. The Chinese government has a problem in that they do not know how many people they have. In China, they cannot count the population. The concept of address does not exist. There is no postal service. The only people who have mail are those inside the party, or those who are working with the party in a manufacturing type position. What's amazing to me is there's no infrastructure there for hospitals. Now, it was so bad I saw a woman hit by a car. She was riding her bicycle. Okay, here you'd have an ambulance come up and take her away. What they did there, they pulled her to the side of the road and watched her die. There was no ambulance going to come. She was not part of the military. She was not part of the party. So instead, they took the bicycle apart, and something else would happen later. Quite dramatic in terms of difference in lifestyles. When I went to the one city there, as you go into the city, you go from people living in tents to people living behind clay walls, and all of a sudden you're downtown, it looks like Paris with Gucci and everybody else, but you stay in the party hotel. Okay. I don't know what China's going to do. I think China is as bad as Yugoslavia in terms of what could happen. They have been using the people from one province to control another province, and there are animosities there. They do not use the word we. They each have their own language. There is one official language that you must use if you're going to be part of the government. I think China is going to be our major contention. They have the capability to do a lot, and they have the capability to be extremely onerous in what will happen to the rest of the world.
I'm Tom Dunn, a City Club member. I guess I was listening to you, and I teach in a liberal arts college, and I was thinking it's the liberal arts majors that are the problem because they're not scientists or they're not taking science courses. However, in my place, we have a nuclear reactor program, and so it's here in Portland. You're not aware of it. A lot of students go through that. They become senior reactor operators. Many of those students are not science majors. They're liberal arts majors. It's kind of neat for them when they're just, say, 18 or 19 years old to be fully qualified to solo on a nuclear reactor. So you can make educational opportunities that will really turn on students. Just because of one man at Reed, that happened there. But there are possibilities out there. And I guess the other thing I'd like to say is that we live in I'm sorry. Well, what's your idea? I've passed out an educational idea. What are your ideas? You're just asking for ideas.
What is my idea for changing the educational system?
Yeah.
I'm also a professor at the University of Porto, so I'm aware of the European system a little bit. One of the things I like about their system is that not everyone can go on to engineering. You have to take the test saying you can do so with the skills upstairs. To me, that's a little bit more efficient. At Iowa State, well, let me put it back. When I went to Purdue for engineering, the dean got all of us together in the School of Music and said, we're a state university. We've allowed everybody in who's in the top half of their class. Unfortunately, that means not all of you will be here next year. Look to the right, look to the left. One of you will be here next year. I'm not sure that's a good way to cultivate or to find the best people to do the job. I do like the idea of Europe, and I think we can learn by some of their techniques in terms of encouraging people to go on who can do the work and of making sure that the people who get into the universities will come out the other end. That's the only way to be efficient.
Kurt Wavering, member. If I understand you right, the energy system is not deregularized. It's a regulatory system. And so I'm wondering what interim steps there are to move towards mechanisms like state energy offices, U.S. Department of Energy, et cetera, and so forth, to begin to get some comprehensive view of energy choices.
Okay. I'm not sure deregulation will continue. If you look at the U.S., we have a problem. There are 50 states. There's no tie-breaking vote. What happens with deregulation is half the states are going to have prices decreasing, the other half will have prices increasing. So therefore, you come to a stalemate when you have an even number of votes. By the way, the state of Virginia has just left the markets and is going back into regulation because the local electric utility there, Dominion, promised lower electric rates. Now, I'm not sure what they're going to do to get those rates they've promised, but my suspicion is they're going to get very lean and mean. Basically, no planning, remove as many super people as you can, and get down to just what you need for this year's operations. I'm not sure that is a good outcome. I think the first thing we have to decide is, do we want competitive markets in the U.S. for electricity? Many states do not. Half the states do not. What does it mean if we really go to a market environment for electricity? How many of you want another phone call during the dinner meal? You get them for cell phones right now, right? I just got one the other night. You've been such a loyal customer, if you sign up for 2 years, we'll give you 2 free months. Do you want the same call coming from all the electric marketers in terms of your electricity or your gas or whatever? I'm not sure. I believe that both systems can work well, but I think the first thing we got to decide is which one do we use? There is a cost to switch, there is a cost to go back. What do we wish to pay for? And do we really have the information to provide that decision in a good, cost-effective manner. That I would say we don't right now. So I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think deregulation is necessarily going to go ahead. It is around the rest of the world, but maybe not here.
Steve Katz, City Club. Would you comment a little bit about the market rates of electricity in reference to Enron? And also, can you just briefly comment about what the French do with their nuclear waste?
Okay. Enron, of course, is an interesting company name around this neck of the woods for many reasons. And of course, they made a good movie out of it. The movie was a little bit tame next to what it really was. One of my students was on the Enron floor when they closed. He was providing the computer support. And I visited Enron a number of times because they were using some of my techniques in terms of valid legal market play. I think Enron, unfortunately, because they chose to be illegal, made a lot of the good things they do seem illegal too, and that's false. They had many people at that company who were quite moral, quite honorable, and followed the law, and did tremendous things. One of the interesting things I think Enron did that most utilities missed at the time is they looked at the gas pipeline system across the U.S., they overlaid it with the electric utility transmission system, and wherever an electric line crossed over a gas line, they installed a gas turbine so that they convert the gas to electricity or not convert the gas to electricity at various locations geographically. This gave them options which is worth tremendous flexibility in terms of congestion on either network. I guess the only thing to say about Enron is that deregulation was the wrong word to use. We cannot deregulate all industry. We cannot let them do whatever they wish. We have to have some business code of conduct, uniform business code, for example, so that we do honorably do things and that we honorably report things that are proper on the balance sheets. And I think some of the things of Enron are showing up everywhere else now. After all, there's a number of questions on bookkeeping and when was that options contract really signed? And I think one thing we must demand our government to do is to enforce the laws that are there.
I'm Jeff Hammerlin, City Club member and also Portland State University faculty. Thank you for your wide-ranging set of comments. I have a question specifically that relates to the potential for integrating wind and hydro here in the Northwest specifically. As you know, the Northwest is fairly unique in that we have about 85% of the hydro capability for electricity in the country. We're nowhere near, when I was a kid, we had about 90% of our power came from hydro. Now it's about 50% in the region, but still that's quite a bit. We're also moving into wind big time. We see all these Vestas turbines going up and down. You mentioned your work in Europe. The closest analogy I could see to what we have in the Northwest is the Scandinavian countries and Nord Pool, a lot of hydro there, a lot of wind. I'm wondering if you've looked at that and you have any recommendations to those of us who are trying to figure out ways to integrate wind and hydro here in the Northwest.
Well, I think that's a very good analogy because Norway and Sweden deregulated quite a while ago. They do open markets. As a matter of fact, their software for their market is now the software for the London's Metals Exchange and the stock market and everything else. The software was so good. One of the interesting things about Norway and Sweden is that the Netherlands now produce 65% of their electricity by wind. What do they do with this wind when it's not running? Well, they've got a high voltage DC line to Norway and Sweden, and when they have wind, Norway and Sweden do not use water. When there's no wind, the water is used for both countries. And this is the European Union model. And I think this is where the states have to get together to start working with each other in terms of energy storage and where the wind is plentiful. In the U.S., I've been told that as of late, there's one wind generator going up every day of the week, Saturdays and Sundays included. The newest wind farm in Ames, Iowa, is 300 generators going up simultaneously. Guess who owns them? Florida Power and Light. What is Florida Power and Light doing in Iowa? They got lost. No, they've just found some efficiencies of scale in terms of what they can install with their labor force. We need to use more of these joint resources across states as well as across countries. BC Hydro, there's a treaty with BC Hydro to store water up there. Hydro-Quebec has loved New York City because they sell water at the price of oil. And there's tremendous water resources up in Canada that can still be tapped into that have not been touched yet. They're only about 15% developed. So I think we need to think about working more with other countries as well as working with the states themselves. And Norway and Sweden have definitely got into the European Union energy market, even though they're not necessarily part of the European Union.
I'm sorry we don't have time for another question. Dr. Sheble, we're glad you're at Portland State University. You've taught us a lot today. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.